Imagine surviving 3 point-blank gunshots to the neck and back, only to discover the man who ordered your death was not a rival gangster, but the newly elected mayor of Chicago. This isn't the plot of a movie. It was a Tuesday in 1932 for Frank Nitti. His story is not the simple tale of a trigger-happy enforcer. It is a complex narrative of a brilliant but paranoid businessman who took the reins of the most feared criminal empire in America, only to be destroyed not by the police, but by the very men he called his friends. The man history remembers as Frank the Enforcer Nitti was born Francesco Raffaele Nitto in a small town in Italy in 1886. He arrived in Brooklyn as a 7-year-old boy, a far cry from the sharp-dressed figure who would later walk the streets of Chicago. He was small in stature, standing only about 5 feet 6 inches tall, and he was not a brawler. In fact, the Enforcer nickname is one of history's great misnomers. Unlike the Hollywood version of his life, where he is portrayed as a violent psychopath, the real Nitti was an introverted businessman who understood that muscle was a tool, not a lifestyle. He had worked as a barber and a fence for stolen goods, a man who preferred to use his head rather than his fists. His true genius was in logistics and finance, a skill that caught the attention of Al Capone, not as a bodyguard, but as the man who could manage the millions of dollars flowing from bootlegging operations. Before he was Capone's right hand, however, Nitti had a wild chapter in Texas that reveals his true, calculating nature. He was a partner in the Galveston crime syndicate, but found himself in a dangerous position after allegedly absconding with a significant sum of money that belonged to his partners. He fled back to Chicago thinking he was safe. Years later, he was recognized in a Houston bar. The mobsters he had crossed, Johnny Jack Nunes and Dutch Voigt, drove straight to Texas, found him, and forcibly transported him back to Galveston. There, they made him return every single penny he had stolen. It was a humiliating lesson that the criminal world was smaller than he thought, and a stark reminder that trust was the most valuable currency of all. By the time Prohibition was in full swing, Nitti had become Capone's trusted lieutenant, not because he could swing a baseball bat, but because he could balance a ledger. When Capone was finally brought down by the federal government for tax evasion in 1931, he was facing an 11-year sentence. He looked at his organization and chose his successor, Frank Nitti. Capone understood that the future of organized crime required a different kind of leader. The roaring, violent 1920s were over. The Depression was on, and the public was tired of gangland murders. They needed a quiet CEO. Nitti fit the bill perfectly. He served a short 18-month sentence for tax evasion, and when he was released in 1932, he officially took the throne. It is here that the story of the Chicago outfit, as it became known, truly begins. Nitti immediately began restructuring the mob like a modern corporation. He slashed payroll, reducing the number of salaried gangsters from nearly 1,000 to about 500. He understood that keeping hundreds of idle gunmen on the books was bad for business and attracted unwanted attention. He moved the organization away from street-level crimes like robbery and prostitution and into the boardroom. Under Nitti, the outfit infiltrated labor unions, which gave them immense power to extort legitimate businesses. They moved into white-collar crimes that were invisible to the public, skimming profits from casinos, and, most famously, turning their eyes to Hollywood. But it was in December of 1932 that Nitti faced his most terrifying challenge, a challenge that would cement his paranoia forever. Chicago's newly elected mayor, Anton Cermak, was determined to break the power of the Capone gang. He wanted his own people in control. On December 19th, 2 Chicago police detectives, Harry Lang and Harry Miller showed up at Nitti's office in the LaSalle Street building. What happened next was not a fair fight. Detective Lang pulled out his gun and shot Nitti 3 times, in the neck and back. As Nitti collapsed, Lang then shot himself in the hand to create a story of self-defense, claiming Nitti had pulled a gun first. Miraculously, Nitti survived, but the story that emerged during the trial was explosive. Testimony revealed that the assassination attempt had been ordered by Mayor Cermak himself. The detectives were not there to make an arrest, they were there to kill. The court heard that Lang had been paid $15,000 for the hit, and other officers testified that Nitti had been completely unarmed. Nitti was acquitted, and the 2 detectives were fired from the force. For Nitti, the message was clear. The highest powers in the city wanted him dead. The paranoia that would later consume him had been justified in the most violent way possible. This event set the stage for one of the most enduring conspiracy theories in American history. Just 2 months after the shooting, Mayor Cermak was in Miami, Florida, standing next to President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt. An Italian immigrant named Giuseppe Zangara opened fire, shouting that he hated rich people. His bullets struck Cermak, who later died from his wounds. The official story is that Zangara was aiming for Roosevelt and missed, but a dark whisper has followed the case for decades, that Zangara was a marksman working for the Chicago outfit, and that Frank Nitti had finally exacted his revenge on the mayor who tried to have him killed. As the 1930s progressed, Nitti became increasingly reclusive and paranoid, hiding behind the title of boss while others like Paul the Waiter Ricca and Tony Accardo jockeyed for real power. He was plagued by claustrophobia, a fear of enclosed spaces that stemmed from his first prison term. The thought of ever going back to a tiny cell was his deepest, most personal terror, and it was this terror that would ultimately be used against him. The beginning of the end came from the Hollywood movie industry. Nitti had sent 2 of his men, Willie Byoff and George Brown, to take over the film labor's unions. For years, they successfully extorted millions of dollars from studios like MGM, Paramount, and 20th Century Fox, threatening labor strikes if they didn't pay up. But Byoff and Brown became greedy and sloppy. In 1941, they were finally caught and convicted. Facing long prison sentences, they made a deal with the prosecutors and became star witnesses against the Chicago mob. In 1943, a massive federal indictment was handed down. Nitti, Ricca, and 6 other top outfit leaders were charged with a sweeping Hollywood extortion plot. The entire leadership of the Chicago outfit was facing decades in prison. The men gathered at Nitti's home to discuss the crisis, but there was no plan for escape, only a plan for blame. Paul Ricca, the ambitious underboss, turned on Nitti. He pointed out that Byoff and Brown were Nitti's personal protégés. Therefore, Nitti should be the one to take the full fall. He should plead guilty and go to prison to protect the rest of them. The demand was a death sentence. For Nitti, the prospect of another prison cell, the claustrophobic walls closing in on him, was worse than any bullet. He refused. The argument was reportedly vicious, with the other mobsters making it clear that if he didn't go to prison for them, they would send him somewhere else, permanently. Nitti knew the code. He knew that his own associates were now plotting his demise. On the morning of March 19, 1943, Frank Nitti had breakfast with his wife Annette at their home in Riverside, Illinois. He told her he was going for a walk. He was heavily intoxicated. His blood alcohol level later measured at .23. He walked about 5 blocks to a railroad yard near the Des Plaines River. As a train slowly backed towards him, railroad workers on board spotted him staggering on the tracks. They shouted a warning. Nitti stepped off the tracks, walked towards a fence, and pulled out a .32 caliber revolver. The train workers watched in horror as he raised the gun to his head. His first shot was unsteady, missing and passing through his fedora. He pulled the trigger again. This time, the bullet slammed into his right jaw and exited through the top of his head. Frank Nitti collapsed against the fence, dead by his own hand. He chose a bullet over the four walls of a prison cell. The man who had survived an assassination attempt ordered by the mayor of Chicago, the man who had restructured the American mafia into a corporate empire, was ultimately brought down by the one thing he could never escape, his own fear. He was buried under the name on his gravestone, Frank Nitti, a final, quiet denial of the Hollywood legend he never truly was.